Shalom from Yerushalayim. I'm Levi Chazan, coming to you from Yeshivat Rayona Yehudi. Parsha Shavua. Welcome back. In this week's parsha, vayishlach, we have the historical meeting between Jacob and his brother Esau. The mighty one of Jacob, finally, after all of these years living at Lavan's house, is finally coming back home. Jacob is making aliyah, together with his wives and his children. Jacob has packed his bags, got in touch with Nefesh B'Nefesh, and it is heading back home. What could be greater than this? We find, though, an interesting thing. We find that these thoughts for aliyah, to come back home, by Jacob, didn't just wake up now after 20 years of being at Lavan's house. But we find after the birth of Joseph, Yaakov Avinu turned to Lavan and said to him, Lavan, it is time that I head back home. I've been here long enough. It is time for me to pack my bags and to go back home to Eretz Yisrael, because we know how important living in the land is. Well, nobody was actually stopping Jacob back then. But Jacob didn't pack up and didn't head home. And it took another 6 years of living in the house of Lavan, where during that time, Jacob had amassed a tremendous amount of wealth, until he finally got the message and did leave to go back to Eretz Yisrael. And of course, the question is, what took Jacob so long to make that step? Initially, he said 6 years earlier, it's time for me to leave. It's time for me to go back home. I got to make aliyah. But it took him 6 years to actually make the move. In fact, making the move wasn't something that came easy for the mighty one of Jacob. For we find that the Torah describes that the children of Lavan, his sons, lo hayu etmol shilshom, they weren't like him. They weren't looking at him like the old days. All of a sudden, anti-Semitism was rising in the house of Lavan. All of a sudden, there was jealousy of Jacob and his tremendous wealth that he was amassing. All of a sudden, they didn't look at him like they used to. It's not a friendly coexistence anymore. But the signs were out there on the wall for Jacob to see. But even that really didn't push Jacob back to Eretz Yisrael. Malach Hashem, the angel of God, had to come and say, Jacob, you got to get out. You can't stay in Lavan's house anymore. You got to come back to Eretz Yisrael. The question is, what's going on over here? He had an interest way back when Joseph was born. But still, he delayed his trip back. He knew he had to leave. Even when the anti-Semitism rose in the house of Lavan, he still didn't pick himself up to leave, until finally Malach Hashem, the angel of God, had to come to him himself and to tell him to pick himself up and to move back to Eretz Yisrael. So as we know, all the actions of our Avotenu, of our forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, all play a big part in the way we act to the descendants to this very day. Maseh avot siman labanim. The ways of the fathers is a sign for the children. Jacob, truth be told, had a hard time uprooting himself from the house of Lavan. He wanted to when Joseph was born. Why? Because once he knew that Rachel had a child, Joseph, he now had an antidote against his evil brother Esau. He would now be able to face him. As the prophets teach us, the house of Esau is straw, and the house of Joseph is fire. The fire lights up the straw to destroy it. So now that Joseph was in the world, he now had something that he could go and to fight back with. He was ready, prepared, but he was also poor. And so Yaakov Avinu stayed in the house of Lavan for another 6 years. And it was during this time that he amassed a tremendous amount of wealth, as the Bible tells us. He had camels, he had donkeys, he had many sheep and goats and slaves, and a tremendous amount. that the children of Lavan were very jealous of him. Everything he did, he was successful in, as Jews are in the exile. And because of this great wealth, it was hard for him to uproot himself and to leave the house of Lavan to come back home. But God had to appear before him and tell him, Jacob, got to get out. Sometimes we don't see the writing on the wall that it is time for the Jews to pick themselves up and to head home. We don't see that writing on the wall. There has to be an action, whether it's anti-Semitism or whatever else may be, to pick ourselves up. And it's a shame that it has to happen in that way. And Jacob gets a promise from God, come back to the land of Eretz Yisrael, v'niyeh itcha. I will be with you. I will protect you. And though we see in this week's parsha that Yaakov is petrified by his meeting with his brother. He divides the camp into 3 separate parts. He gives him tremendous presents. He bows down to him. He's petrified of this meet with his brother. But on the other hand, he had a promise from God that God will protect him. Why? So why should he be petrified? Why should he need to be afraid? If God himself comes to you and says, I will protect you, what fear is there? Still, Jacob was fearful. We see how great the commandment of living in the land of Eretz Yisrael is. Jacob said to himself, all of these years, all of these 20 years, I've been living in the house of Lavan. I have not been fulfilling the commandments of the Torah or of living in the land of Eretz Yisrael, which is, as our rabbis teach us, equal to all the commandments in the Torah. On the other hand, my brother Esav has been living in the land of Eretz Yisrael. He has been honoring his father all these years. He has great zchut, great merit. Maybe I will not be able to overcome him. So in spite of the fact that God had promised him that he would be with him, Jacob was petrified because he didn't have the mitzvah of the land of Eretz Yisrael standing on his side. So we see, my friends, in this week's parsha, the great value of Eretz Yisrael and how hard it is to uproot ourselves and to leave the exiles. This is the message that has to be brought down from this week's parsha. Even the mighty one of Jacob had a hard time leaving the gold fields of the golden Medina in Lavan's house to come back. And he was afraid because Esav had that zchut. Esav had that merit of staying in the land of Eretz Yisrael and being there. And that was a great merit. And that's why Jacob was so frightful and so afraid. This should be the message to all of us. Hey, I'm Levi Chazan. I'm coming to you from Yeshivat Rayon Yehudi in Yerushalayim. Until next time. I like you. Always have. Always will.